Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for the e-launch and discussion of the State of Southeast Asia 2026 Survey Report. I am Indira Zahra Aridati from the ASEAN Studies Centre at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, and I will be your MC this morning. Before we begin, please allow me to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. This event is on the record and open to the media. The ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute reserves the right to make audio and visual recordings of the webinar and post the recording on our website. For technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function stating your name and affiliation and direct your question to the relevant speaker. For those who wish to quote any of the speakers, we ask that you first seek the speaker's consent. Thank you for your cooperation. To outline the proceedings, Mr. Ng Chee Khern, Director and Chief Executive Officer of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, will deliver his welcome remarks and launch the survey. Mr. Ng Chee Khern assumed the role of Director and Chief Executive Officer of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute on 1 April 2026. Before joining ISEAS, Mr. Ng served 41 years in the public service, where he held key roles including Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Manpower from 2022 to 2025, Permanent Secretary for Smart Nation and Digital Government in the Prime Minister's Office from 2017 to 2022, Permanent Secretary for Defense Development in the Ministry of Defense from 2014 to 2017, and Director of the Security and Intelligence Division from 2010 to 2014. Before joining the civil service, he was Chief of Air Force from 2006 to 2009. Following the welcome remarks, Ms. Joanne Lin, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Centre, will share the key findings before the discussion with our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Scot Marciel, Senior Advisor at the BowerGroupAsia, Dr. Saya Kiba, Associate Professor at the Kobe City University of Foreign Studies, Dr. Wang Huiyao, Founder and President of the Center for China and Globalization, who will be with us until 10 a.m., and Mr. Wang Zichen, Deputy Secretary General at the Center for China and Globalization, who will take over from Dr. Wang after 10 a.m., and Professor Herman Kraft, Professor at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. The discussion on the survey's findings will be moderated by Mr. Ng. Without further ado, I now have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Ng Chee Khern, Director and CEO of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, to deliver the welcome remarks. Mr. Ng, please.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the State of Southeast Asia 2026 Survey Report, a flagship publication of the ASEAN Studies Centre at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Since 2019, the annual survey report has continued to draw strong interest from policymakers, academics, and media worldwide who seek to analyze elite opinions in the diverse and rapidly changing Southeast Asian region. The survey has established itself as an important platform for amplifying Southeast Asian perspectives on the key issues and challenges facing us. It also remains the Institute's most widely read and frequently cited publication. This year's survey brings together the views of 2008 opinion leaders from across all 11 ASEAN member states. Our respondents come from a diverse range of backgrounds, including academia and think tanks, the private sector, civil society and media, government, as well as regional and international organizations. The survey was conducted over a 6-week period from 5th January to 20th February 2026. This period coincided with heightened geopolitical uncertainties, including developments following the United States intervention in Venezuela, as well as preceding tensions in the Middle East. But it wouldn't have captured opinions that had formed since America's intervention in Iran. These developments have likely shaped regional perceptions and influenced how respondents view strategic risks. We are also pleased to share that following Timor-Leste's full accession to ASEAN, the country is now fully included in the ASEAN weighted average of the survey, rather than being treated separately, which is an important methodological update from previous editions. At the same time, we continue to examine enduring concerns such as how to move the Myanmar issue forward, perceptions of major powers' leadership, the relevance of ASEAN's dialogue partners, and the future of the region's relations with the United States and China. Many of you may be keen to understand how the region perceives and evaluates the major powers in terms of trust and distrust, especially as ASEAN navigates an increasingly uncertain global landscape. Looking ahead, the accumulation of 8 years of data will allow us to carry out time series analysis to track ongoing trends and identify new developments. At the same time, country-level data will enable more detailed and nuanced studies. Our researchers at the Institute will continue to undertake in-depth analysis of the data sets in the months ahead, mainly through our Institute's blog platform, fulcrum.sg, as well as other forms of publication. I hope all of you will stay tuned to these insights. With that, I'm delighted to be joined by an outstanding panel from Southeast Asia, Japan, China, and the US. We are honored to welcome Ambassador Scot Marciel, Dr. Kiba, Dr. Wang Huiyao, and Professor Herman Kraft, who will share their reflection on the year's survey findings and what they review about Southeast Asia's place in a changing global landscape. Before inviting our panelists to share their perspectives, let me first invite Ms. Joanne Lin to present the key findings from the State of Southeast Asia 2026 Survey Report. Joanne.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ng, and a very good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you who are joining us from the region and beyond. It's really my pleasure to present to you some of the findings from the State of Southeast Asia 2026 survey, which is now in its 8th edition since it was started in 2019. So as Mr. Ng has mentioned, this survey gauges the views and perceptions of Southeast Asians who are really in a position to inform on geopolitical developments, major power influence, and rivalry that's affecting the region. So this year, we had a total of 2,008 respondents from Southeast Asia, including Timor-Leste, which is very much a full-fledged member of ASEAN. And I am also going to briefly cover the methodology, but I'm going to focus more on the substance later. Our respondents are screened based on their knowledge of ASEAN and interest in current affairs. So the survey consists of 43 questions this year and was conducted over a period of 6 weeks from the beginning of Jan to the middle of Feb. And the survey was also offered in 7 languages. So apart from English, we have Bahasa Indonesia, Burmese, Tamil, Thai, Vietnamese, and Tatum for Timor-Leste for the very first time. And equal weightage was also applied to all ASEAN member states to ensure that each country's responses are represented in equal proportion. So now let me highlight briefly on the respondents' profile. Of the 2,008 respondents that we have, 12.3% are from Singapore, followed by Indonesia at 11.8% and the Philippines at 10.5%. But please do not be too concerned, as the differences in respondent numbers will not affect the ASEAN-wide findings as country weightage is applied, as I have mentioned earlier. And as similar to last year, the largest affiliation group is from the private sector at 42.9%. This is an increase from 30% last year, followed by the government sector at 21.1%, the academia and research sector at 19.5%, civil society, NGOs, and the media at 11.2%, and the smallest affiliation group is from the regional and international organizations at about 5%. So now this is the moment that we are waiting for, because I'm going to go into the substantive findings on the regional outlook and views on international developments. So on the top three challenges facing Southeast Asia, where respondents can choose three options, a majority of Southeast Asians at 60% identify climate change and intensifying extreme weather events as the region's most pressing challenge. And this percentage is slightly higher than last year, and is the top choice for 6 ASEAN member states, especially the Philippines, Indonesia, and Laos, where really agriculture remains a vital pillar of their economies. And worries about intensifying economic tensions between major powers is now the second most pressing issue, while concern over domestic political instability has emerged as the third option this year, given internal divisions, leadership transitions, and of course governance challenges as well in several member states. On the top three geopolitical concerns across the 8 geopolitical events that we surveyed this year, U.S. leadership under President Trump has overtaken concerns over the South China Sea last year to become the top concern this year. So this perception really demonstrates regional anxieties around U.S. leadership and its long-term commitments. And this is the top concern among respondents from Singapore, followed by Indonesia and Laos. Global scam operations continue to rank second this year, while aggressive behavior in the South China Sea is the third place, and it ranked the highest for 3 ASEAN claimant states, which are the Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei. The Cambodia-Thailand border conflict is ranked 4th. It's not reflected here in this slide, with Thailand and Cambodia respondents indicating this as their top choice. And the ongoing Myanmar crisis is ranked 5th, with Myanmar respondents choosing it as their top concern. So on the top concern about ASEAN, it continues to be the sentiment that the regional organization is slow and ineffective and thus cannot cope with fluid political and economic developments. So this is the top concern for most ASEAN member states. And the second top concern is that ASEAN risks becoming an arena for major power competition, and its members may become major power proxies. The third ranking concern is ASEAN's inability to respond effectively to internal crisis. An interesting question on the developments in the South China Sea. The top concern among ASEAN respondents is China's encroachment in the exclusive economic zones and continental shelves of Southeast Asia's littoral states at 51.7%. This is slightly higher than last year. And that underscores that really sovereignty, maritime rights, and access to resources remain at the heart of regional anxieties. And this concern is especially strong among claimant states, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Brunei. The second most cited concern is the risk of an accidental confrontation between an ASEAN member state and China that could result in a political crisis, followed by China's militarization and assertive actions in the South China Sea. And when we asked about the code of conduct in the South China Sea, which the Philippines, as the ASEAN chair, is trying to finalize this year, the dominant position among ASEAN respondents, and that's also similar to last year, is that the COC must be aligned with international law, including UNCLOS. So that reinforces the importance of a rule-based maritime order. And nearly 1/5 of the respondents believe that the COC will prevent other powers from conducting military activities and energy exploration with ASEAN member states in the South China Sea. And at the same time, respondents also exhibit a very pragmatic understanding of the COC's potential limitations. 16.5% of the respondents feel that the COC will not resolve territorial disputes, although it could help to reduce tensions, and around 12% believe that it will not materialize because China simply will not give up its claims. And moving the Myanmar issue forward, regional respondents prefer to engage in independent dialogue with all stakeholders. That's similar to last year. And the second preferred option is to downgrade or limit ASEAN's engagement with the regime at 18.5%, and that's a slight increase from last year. Ranking third is utilizing harder methods to increase the regime's cost for non-compliance with the ASEAN 5-point consensus, and ranking last at only only 6% is the non-interference option, even though this is the key principle for ASEAN, and that shows that the region actually prefers ASEAN to be proactive. And in a new question that we have this year, and that is against the backdrop of the worsening Cambodia-Thailand border tensions last year, more than a third of the respondents at almost 40% agree that ASEAN has taken active steps to mediate the crisis through the convening of several ministerial meetings and the deployment of diplomatic engagement. And that is a top choice for most ASEAN member states, including Cambodia and Thailand themselves. The second most preferred option is the perspective that ASEAN is doing its best within its institutional limits. And this is followed by the view that ASEAN is not utilizing all the tools at its disposal, supported by around 13% of the respondents. And we also have a new question this year on the biggest impediment to ASEAN's intra-regional economic cooperation. The survey suggests that ASEAN's biggest barriers to deeper integration are internal rather than external. So the top two impediments are really domestic technocratic capacity to implement and enforce ASEAN initiatives, followed by development disparities among ASEAN member states, pointing to structural constraints within ASEAN itself. And geopolitical pressures also remain rather significant at 27.5%, but ranked behind these internal challenges. So with that, I will stop here for the first round of presentation, and I'm going to pass the floor over to Mr. Ng to moderate the discussion for about 30 minutes before I start the second round of presentation on major powers. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne, for the presentation. I think what comes across very clearly from the first session is that Southeast Asia is operating in a much more complex and demanding environment than before. I mean, coming into the Institute from outside, I was a bit surprised that the top concern was actually climate change and not anything that's geopolitical. So that already shows that the region's concerns are now driven by a combination of pressures, and climate change being a key one. At the same time, many of the region's long-standing flashpoints remain unresolved, especially the South China Sea and Myanmar. But what is also striking this year is the emergence of newer or more prominent concerns, such as the Cambodia-Thailand conflict and broader doubts about ASEAN's own effectiveness in responding to both internal and external challenges. Another important takeaway that I have is that these issues are becoming more deeply interconnected. Economic anxieties are no longer separate from geopolitics. Security concerns are also increasingly tied up with domestic instability, transnational crime, and institutional weakness. Even new regional initiatives such as the Digital Economic Framework are being viewed not just in terms of ambition, but also in terms of whether ASEAN member states are ready to implement them. In that sense, the survey is not only telling us what Southeast Asians are worried about, it is also asking a bigger question of whether ASEAN can continue to show practical relevance, both in managing crises and in delivering meaningful cooperation and outcomes. The challenge today, therefore, goes beyond how the region responds to external pressures, but also how ASEAN strengthens its own capacity to act amid growing uncertainty. In many ways, that's key to what ASEAN centrality is, whether ASEAN has its own agency. So with that in mind, let me now invite our panelists to reflect on what these findings mean for ASEAN and for the region more broadly. Maybe if I could start with climate change, since that's the top concern expressed by the respondents. Climate change and extreme weather events remain Southeast Asia's top challenge this year. It is a top challenge in 6 of the member states, especially in Philippines, Indonesia, and Laos. I would like to ask, say, particularly Dr. Kraft and Dr. Kiba, what do you think are the factors explaining its rise as a top concern in Southeast Asia? And what does this reveal about evolving priorities in the region?
If I may, thank you very much for the question. Actually, the interesting aspect about this is the extent to which the issue of climate change has actually been a constant, top notcher, if you will, as far as the main concerns of Southeast Asia is concerned. In terms of looking at the main concerns of Southeast Asia, it's been there since, I mean, you go back last year's survey, the year before. And I think this is a reflection of, number one, the increasing recognition of how the climate change, as reflected in terms of typhoons, for instance, right, has actually been affecting the everyday lives of people in Southeast Asia. Increasing frequency, the increasing intensity of typhoons, for instance, have led to floods, destruction of agricultural economies around the region. And so it's not surprising that climate change remains the most important consideration as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, especially for coastal and archipelagic states.
Okay. Yeah, if I may, I also would like to point two things. So first, of course, it's because of the exposure to the news or international media. This is an elite survey, and then most of the respondents are the readers or the watchers of the online news, both local and foreign media. So they see the calamities and the climate change impact in the neighboring issues, not only in neighboring countries, not only in their own countries. So that's why the Philippines, Indonesia, Laos, Brunei, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam, both maritime Southeast Asia and continental Southeast Asia, they are all aware of those things. And the second reason probably is the visibility in the policies. So now the carbon neutral or the zero emission is everywhere in the policy, and it's materialized in the top priority of the policy programs in each country. So that's why, I guess.
Thank you very much for that. If I could ask a subsidiary question, and just to see whether you have any views on it, whether the respective governments are doing enough in response.
I think there are clear elements that's actually being undertaken. The main problem, I think, at this point in time is the extent to which cooperation across the region is actually being operationalized. Although I think there are very clear attempts. The regional report that ASEAN has actually put out is an indication of the seriousness with which this issue is actually being undertaken. But again, it goes back to a point that was mentioned earlier, that the unevenness of capabilities across the region of different countries, of course, is a factor in the effectiveness of the response, or at least the differences in terms of how different countries are further affected and therefore able to respond to the impact of climate change conditions.
Dr. Kiba, do you have any views?
I fully agree with Dr. Herman.
Okay, thank you very much. I think from your responses, it's clear to me that there will be topics that would sort of require or have us do further research on. That's useful, your points. Thank you very much. Maybe if I could move to a second issue, which is about the US leadership overtaking the South China Sea as the top geopolitical concern. Across 8 geopolitical events surveyed, US leadership under President Trump is now the top concern at 51.9%, overtaking aggressive behavior in the South China Sea at 48.2%, which was the top concern last year. Concern over US leadership is especially high in Singapore, Indonesia, and Laos. How should we interpret this shift, and what does it suggest about regional perceptions of US reliability and leadership? I mean, for this, clearly the primary panelist who should make some comments will be Ambassador Scot. But if the other 3 panelists would like to add on any comments, I'll welcome it as well. Ambassador?
Thank you. Well, my answer may be a little bit biased, both because I'm an American and because I was an American diplomat for so long. But I think fundamentally we should interpret it as, it's not surprising given what we've seen, but I think it reflects the rather dramatic change we've seen in U.S. foreign policy under the second Trump administration. I think for many years, decades really, the United States for whatever flaws and mistakes it made, was seen in the region generally as a provider and even guarantor of security and a promoter and supporter of international norms, international law, and international institutions. There was a lot of predictability to what the U.S. Would do in foreign policy. And I think that was really important for the region, even when there were disagreements with what the U.S. did. And then you have the Trump administration come in, and first the imposition of the high tariffs, immediate and direct impact. You have flouting of international norms. I mean, Venezuela, you could argue Cuba, and the trade actions themselves, and just turning away, the Trump administration turning away from longstanding U.S. foreign policies and practices. So all that has injected a lot of uncertainty and economic turmoil into the region. And probably the unpredictability part probably adds to concerns about any potential about U.S.-China relations and competition. And so it shows a lack of confidence or declining confidence in U.S. reliability. Again, because of the Trump administration's rather dramatic rejection of longstanding U.S. foreign policy, as well as the transactional and unpredictable aspect of Trump's foreign policy, the elimination of USAID, withdrawal from international agreements and organizations, these sorts of things. And of course, as you pointed out at the beginning, this survey took place before the Iran conflict. The U.S. started the Iran conflict along with Israel, which obviously is having a major impact economically on the region, but also raising concerns about what kind of role the U.S. is playing in the region and in the world.
Would any of the other three panelists like to make any comments relative to the findings or in response to ambassadors' comments?
Yes, perhaps I could add some comments as well. My name is Henry Wang. I'm the founder of the Center for China Globalization. What I think that we have on these surveys is very significant, and it's probably we are having a paradigm shift there. Of course, I think I agree with the ambassador. That the U.S. administration, particularly since Trump took over last year, we have seen actually a lot of turmoil has been happening, and we've seen that in Venezuela, we've seen Greenland, in Canada, U.S. and Israel. So, I mean, that I can understand the ASEAN countries and prosperity being jeopardized, wars and AI wars and things like that. So what I felt is that it should give a very big concern. But I have a little question about this, American leadership in South China Sea and concerns. So I would think that, now ASEAN are China's largest trading partner, and this part of the world, particularly Asia, is really the oasis.
Sorry, Dr. Wang, your comms is interrupted.
Of peace and prosperity. They're going to lead the global trade visit to Beijing, a lot of progress to stabilize the world situation. And also kind of, not surprised to see that findings of concern on the U.S. behavior in the South China Sea. So I would think that, we're going to see a lot of good talk. We're going to see a lot of dialogue. We're going to have the trade, have the peace, and, not hegemony and also unilateralism. I think ASEAN countries are deeply concerned. They don't want to pick sides, but the current behavior of U.S. administration is really big. The world is worried, and I'm sure ASEAN will do the same. So I think in this aspect, China would continue to trade. We're going to continue RCEP. China wants to join CPTPP, and we're going to make the trade as a backbone of this part of the world. Of course, with more security, peace, and also continue to talk about code of conduct on South China Sea and promoting cooperation between China and ASEAN. So I would think that we have to weather this kind of destruction that we're being seen right now, and we hope that we're going to stabilize the region. And I think ASEAN has a lot of things to offer to stabilize for the prosperity of this part of the world and for the global world in general.
Thanks, Dr. Wang. Your communication was interrupted at various points, but I think your general point was that given the developments, ASEAN could well sort of facing the sort of increased unpredictability and the transactional nature of the relationship with the US, that ASEAN may well work more closely with Chinese over time. I think that's your main point, and that working more closely with China could well be a more stabilizing factor. But if I could ask you to maybe just check your computer, because you were coming interrupted at various points. Dr. Kiba and Dr. Kraft, would you have any further comments?
Sure. I agree completely with the idea that the transactional way by which the Trump administration has actually approached foreign policy is somewhat disrupted calculations across the region, I think. But to a certain extent, what's quite interesting here is that is the extent to which I think I agree with what Ambassador Marciel was actually saying earlier on, that in as much as this is actually something that took place prior to the war on Iran, then I suspect that attitudes and perspectives across the region might actually be even hardening a little bit more, as far as how they're looking at the case of the United States and its leadership across the region. The issue is, to a large extent, really more the question of unpredictability, right? The way by which the Trump administration is actually going in different directions, and for countries that might actually see the United States as being a key player as far as maintaining a balanced geopolitical condition in the region, its tendency to look at different issue areas actually create a context of uncertainty in terms of whether or not the United States should be seen or continue to be seen as being able to provide that context of being a balancing player in a region that's increasingly dominated, by China. And the point that Dr. Wang was actually saying earlier on about how much countries in the region might actually see China as a much more stable partner is actually something that has to be taken into consideration as far as how we should see what the ASEAN countries should be taking into consideration. And from if we look at U.S. foreign policy, is a reality that the United States will have to actually seriously consider the way that it's actually proceeding with how it deals with the partners in the region.
Thank you. Dr. Kiba, would you have any comments?
Yes, yeah. So there was a doubt against the U.S. presence, the presence or lack of presence in the region for the past years, even during the Biden administration and the first Trump administration. But it's just more on the lack of, the absence during the East Asian Summit, the ASEAN-related summits like that. So it's totally different. It was more, before it was lack of presence, but now it's more on uncertainty, and then such a transactional act represented by the tariff negotiation. So I think that something has changed, and then now it is considered as a geopolitical concern, not really it's I think so. That's new this year, I guess.
Thanks, Dr. Kiba. Maybe I could move on to a next topic that is also of high interest. And there's an online question that I would fall into this discussion now, because the online question is about whether the survey is any indication that Southeast Asia increasingly see security and economic initiatives emerging outside ASEAN, and whether we should interpret that as a sign that ASEAN centrality is weakening. And this sort of ties in with the top concern in ASEAN, where 34.7% of respondents say that ASEAN is slow and ineffective and cannot cope with fluid economic and political developments. And while 32.2% say that ASEAN is becoming an arena of major power competition. These findings do suggest that ASEAN is being tested both institutionally and strategically, and whether its centrality would be under threat. In today's increasingly complex environment, how should the organization like ASEAN respond? And if I could mainly ask Professor Kraft to respond to this first, and then the other three members who are actually non-ASEAN nationalities could jump in as you wish.
Yeah, thank you. The perceptions that are reflected in those two stats, right, are actually not mutually exclusive. That is to say that if we take a look at the concerns about the idea that ASEAN tends to be slow in decision making, and that somehow I think this actually slides into the notion that that slowness, that inability to actually deal with regional issues in a way that reassures our partners has opened the way for fears that that there's a gap, a vacuum that this is actually creating from a leadership position. And this is now being filled by the issue of the intensifying competition between China and the United States. So they're not mutually exclusive. One actually leads into the other. In 1994, the ASEAN's partners actually saw ASEAN as actually being able to provide a leadership role within the region at a time when there was a shift in geopolitical conditions. I think concerns within ASEAN, among ASEAN, the ASEAN respondents, reflect a perspective that confidence is waning, right? And that that ASEAN needs to actually do more about this particular position. It is structural. It is something that's actually problematic as far as ASEAN is concerned, and goes back to the question of the extent to which you have 10, now 11 countries actually being able to agree on what the key issues are, and the extent to which ASEAN's institutions as they exist now is able to actually to effectively respond to the quickly changing context of regional conditions. And so I think some of the things that ASEAN has to take into consideration, and seriously so, is a quick review of the charter, perhaps, to actually see whether it is necessary for ASEAN to actually strengthen institutions, or whether existing informal ways of conducting things can be made to be more effective, right? Frequency of meetings, not meetings, but frequency of consultations among governments might actually be something that that might show that there's no need to actually change existing institutions, but a need to more effectively utilize what's there at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kraft. There's a live question, online question, that is related to this point of ASEAN centrality that I thought it's useful to address now. which is that this is from Daryl Lu from Straits Times. Based on the responses in the survey, with the top concern about ASEAN being slow and ineffective, and with the recent Thai-Cambodia conflict, do you perceive a desire among countries for ASEAN to move faster and be more directly involved in resolving cross-border conflicts? This question is directed to Dr. Lin. So maybe if I could ask Joanne to respond to this. But before Joanne respond to this, maybe I'll just ask one more question, which this is again from Daryl Lu from Straits Times. The question is for Professor Kraft again. That the past 3 years, ASEAN's chosen alignment has shifted between the US and China. Looking ahead, do you expect ASEAN's shifting preference between the two to continue? Or do you think recent events such as the war in Iran will decisively change the equilibrium? Professor Kraft to answer this, but before all that, also for Dr. Wang to maybe address this question as well, and maybe any more general thought that you have, because I know you have to leave at 10 o'clock, and we would welcome your views on the US-China issue, even though it's actually for the next half, but we would like your views on that as well. So Joanne first, then Professor Kraft, and Dr. Wang.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ng. So that question from Darren. So basically, as you can see that the key messages in the survey, and as also you have highlighted, are not only external, right? So it also shows some growing awareness of ASEAN's own internal constraints, whether it's in implementing plans or addressing development disparities, or even doubts about its ability to respond effectively to crises like the Cambodia-Thailand border conflict. But I still think that, and there are many questions in the survey to prove this, that despite this sort of concerns, respondents still feel that ASEAN is important, and they see ASEAN as actually a stabilizing platform to really balance, strengthen resilience, and also enhance its strategic autonomy. And of course, we also saw that ASEAN is slow and consensus bound to move with very fast political and economic development. So what I would say is that ASEAN needs to move beyond depending less on rhetorics and its convening power, coming up with statements, and really focus more on delivery. So it needs to show that ASEAN's agency means stronger internal cohesion. Building unity and internal cohesion is very important so that it can actually have better implementation capacity, and of course a greater willingness to use all the tools that it already has. ASEAN has many tools, but it doesn't mean that all of them are being utilized. So maybe in the coming days, I'm going to start addressing all this and start writing a couple of papers on it. Thank you.
Thanks. So if I could just quickly summarize what Professor Kraft and Dr. Lin has answered, which is that ASEAN centrality is still there, but probably requires more work. If I could then move on to the US-Chinese sort of ASEAN's alignment between US and China, Prof. Kraft, for your comments on that, as asked by Daryl Lu from Straits Times, and then Dr. Wang can add on to it, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take off from the previous point about ASEAN centrality, right? I think one of the things that ASEAN is finding problematic is that centrality tends to be outward looking, right? The idea of ASEAN centrality. Let's say that we would like our partners to actually see ASEAN as being central to the wider region, right? But I think one of the key points here is the extent to which ASEAN should be seen as being central in the foreign policies of the ASEAN countries themselves. That is to say that if we talk about ASEAN centrality in terms of ASEAN being central to the foreign policy of Southeast Asian countries, of the ASEAN member states, then I think that would go a long way, in terms of resolving the some of the internal issues that Joanne was actually pointing out earlier on. So, which then brings us to the question of this being forced to take sides, and whether the situation in the Middle East right now might actually make states that in Southeast Asia who might actually prefer the United States as a strategic partner, for instance, rethink that particular point. And of course, a key country in this particular question is, of course, the Philippines. But this depends really on, because to a certain extent, it's a question of taking sides, right? ASEAN has said, and the ASEAN countries have repeatedly stated that they do not want to take sides, right? And so this issue of taking sides, this issue of being forced to take sides, it's really a reflection on the ability of ASEAN to actually stand its ground, to maintain its position. And the idea of ASEAN centrality as a key strategic point, as far as regional politics is concerned. And so to that, I think if ASEAN focuses more on its internal cohesion, as Joanne pointed out earlier on, then it puts it in a better position to deal with both the United States and with China, right? Not being maybe moving one way or the other depending on issues, but then definitely not being forced to strategically take sides, as far as the competition between China and the United States is concerned. So I think strengthening ASEAN cohesion, and making ASEAN more logically focused on its own concerns, its own perspective as to how the region should actually proceed, puts it in a better position to deal with both China and the United States.
Prof. Kraft, that's a point very well taken. I remember reading the speech of our current Senior Minister, Lee Hsien Loong's. He gave a speech at the 50th anniversary of ISEAS, and that was one of the key points that he did make, that for ASEAN cohesion and for ASEAN centrality, individual countries need to show strong commitment to the idea of ASEAN. So ASEAN centrality, as you pointed out, is not just about whether ASEAN has some convening power or has agency outside of ASEAN, but actually whether ASEAN centrality is even a key consideration in the individual countries' sort of, I guess, foreign policy and strategic thinking. Dr. Wang?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for this excellent discussion here, and also the report. I think, we hear so much now, and that's absolutely right. I mean, ASEAN should remain centrality and remains neutral, and also not taking side. I mean, that would be the bottom line, I think, of the ASEAN, and not inviting troubles, because what do we see now, for example? I mean, as I said at the beginning, this unipolar world is gone, and we should not seek any leadership or any strong backing of certain country just for your own sake. We see that happen. I mean, European Union is a good example. I mean, European Union used to be centrality and also quite neutral, but now they take a side, and then they expand NATO, and we see what happened. And the same for Middle East. Middle East, we have so many countries now have U.S. military base there, and has a lot of aligned with U.S. And then now even fighting a median sanctioned 40 years country like Iran. The Middle East was not protected by the U.S. and suffered from that as well. So I think the current prosperity and peace in ASEAN and in Asia is so rare and so valuable. The reason for that is because of China. China has generated the prosperity and become the biggest largest partner for all ASEAN countries, and that boom is still continuing. And also for the earlier topic, we talked about climate change. China leads the green power revolution and lead a great power industrialization now, and it could benefit again ASEAN countries. And furthermore, China, we haven't sent any soldiers or occupy any places. I mean, in the last 40-some years, I mean, since 1979, China never started any war or did anything on that. China, philosophy of China is that it's agricultural, Confucius culture. You basically, your parents are alive, you don't travel far away, you cultivate your land, year after year. And China now doing things, one 5-year plan after another 5-year plan. So I think that provides a cornerstone of the peace and prosperity for Asia. So I think it's more important for ASEAN countries to really strengthen this economic globalization. We are now seeing a two paradigm. One is the over-securitization, over-militarization, over-weaponization, not only on military, but on trade, on everything. But we should also, on the China, pursue economic integration, economic cooperation, and economic trade liberalization, and things like that. So RCEP is the most successful, largest free trade agreement in this part of the world. And that's ASEAN initiated that, and China, Australia, Japan, everybody is in it. So I think it's great. We will continue that path rather than we broken that and inviting all the troubles. I think current U.S. administration is so busy with their, Latin America, consolidate the Western Hemisphere, and then expanding into Greenland and Venezuela and all the others. And now we're having Iran is in the middle of this big crisis now. So that's all serve as a very bad example of how that if you've broken neutrality, if you've broken centrality, then you're going to have all those problems. So I think it's important that we have this successful model of East Asia, we have this successful model of economic integration, and we have this, the biggest risk that we have is to violate this kind of prosperity and trade progress. Losing prosperity is the biggest risk going to have. So we can't decouple, we cannot de-risk, we have to really work together. And I think even for US and China, and President Trump is pragmatic, and he comes to China, and we're going to talk about that. And, also, we're going to see what's going to happen to Taiwan and Taiwan Strait. We'll see a lot of movement. KMT president is visiting mainland this month in a few days. We're going to see a lot of stabilizing effect of China producing this part of the world. And I hope that ASEAN China Summit, and also we can continue this Code of Conduct South China Sea talks. China maintain good relatively terms with Indonesia, with Brunei, even with Vietnam. We have top leaders visiting each other in Vietnam. I think we should do that with Philippines as well. So let's stabilize rather than we inviting foreign influence, foreign intervention. Because I remember early years, Hillary Clinton, when she said we are not taking sides in South China Sea. Now U.S. is not taking sides, but also put military base in the Philippines. So that is going to have a lot of implications. So I would think, now we are having an economic boom for this part of the world. It's so important. That's the bread and butter. That's everybody, all the people, all the voters are looking for. So that's the biggest security we can't jeopardize. I think that's China can provide. And that's very important. So we're going to see this trend continue on top of the climate change fighting and green and digital and AI and name it. We're going to have a lot of cooperation. And I think U.S. can do a lot of good too if U.S. and China can really get along and have its bottom line, core interest, and not really interfere each other internal affairs and affairs in the other related area. We're going to have a coexistence, a peaceful world for years to come. But for now, what the world has been seeing, what ASEAN has been seeing, is China is very stable. China has high moral ground now, and China, the Foreign Minister Wang is talking for all the foreign ministers, and China is participating, talking with the Pakistan Foreign Minister, trying to mediate this Iranian war. I would think that we're going to continue to have ASEAN-China golden era to come. And that would be my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Wang. So I think your main comment has to do with the fact that if ASEAN is to be central, one of the key things that it has to continue to do is to not take sides and I guess focus on economic development particularly. And thanks very much. I know you have to leave after this. I hope to meet you again at some point. Thanks very much. Maybe if I could invite Ambassador Marciel, whether you have any response to the comments made so far, and then we'll close off this section and go on to the next section.
Thank you. I appreciate all those comments. I don't want to turn this into a U.S.-China debate, so I'm not going to say too much in response to Dr. Wang's points. I would just note that I was very honest about my assessment of how the Trump administration's policies have been perceived in the region. But I would note that there's great wariness in the region toward both big powers for good reasons, including China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and refusal to accept international law. But I don't want to get into a debate over that. On ASEAN centrality, it just strikes me that ASEAN centrality is something that most of the major powers have agreed with and supported, and it's a good idea. But I think everybody has recognized that ASEAN's ability to actually deal with crises, even within Southeast Asia, is limited. And that's just the way, the ASEAN way very much limits it. I mean, if you look at the situation in Myanmar, it's horrific. It's horrific. I was ambassador there for 4.5 years. I know the country very well, and I know the horrific military that's now running it. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And I think ASEAN could do more, but I think it's a very difficult problem to solve. But I think ASEAN centrality is kind of, to me, ASEAN gets first crack at trying to solve problems, but often wants to do it in conjunction with others when it can't solve it by itself. And I think ASEAN centrality is always also really important for all the bigger powers, the whole region, because the convening power, while it's not sufficient, does allow all of us to get together and meet. And I think if China or the US or Japan tried to organize these meetings, there may be some nervousness and suspicion. And ASEAN has the trust, I think, of all the countries, of all the powers. And so its central role in bringing all of us together to discuss these issues, I think is critical, and I hope it continues, even if ASEAN is handicapped in terms of actually addressing some of the crises that emerge.
Thanks, Ambassador. I think your comments is probably quite reassuring to many people who are dialing in. So if I could hand to Joanne for the next part of the seminar.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ng. So now let me move to the section on major powers, regional influence and leadership. On the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia, China continues to dominate perceptions at 55.9%, slightly down from last year, reflecting China's continued economic centrality to the region. And the US remains the second most influential power at 15.3%. However, a majority of respondents remain worried about China's growing economic influence, while concern over the US economic influence has also risen significantly this year, and it's something to be noted, especially amongst the export-oriented economies like Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. And here you see that China also remains the most influential political and strategic power at 40%, similar to last year and many other years before, followed by the US at 29.9% and ASEAN at 15.3%. So this underscores that the region still sees the strategic landscape primarily through a China-US lens. And at the same time, you can see here that China and US generate significant worry for the region, with concern about US increasing this year. And by contrast, ASEAN's political strategic standing is welcomed by over 68% of respondents, suggesting a strong regional preference for ASEAN to serve as a stabilizing force amidst the intensifying rivalry. And again, one of a very popular question that we have, in terms of dialogue partner strategic relevance to ASEAN, China continues to rank first, followed by the US and Japan, with a slightly wider gap this year between China and the US. And that suggests that perceptions of Beijing's strategic relevance have strengthened relative to Washington over the past year. And beyond the top three, the EU remains in the fourth place, followed by Australia. And one notable shift this year is that South Korea has actually edged ahead of India. And while the UK, Russia, Canada, and New Zealand continue to be viewed as more secondary players in ASEAN's strategic calculations. And when we ask about leadership in championing global free trade, ASEAN itself ranked first, ahead of China and the EU, with the US actually falling to the fourth place at close to 15%. And this actually reflects growing concern over perhaps the US trade leadership under the second Trump administration, particularly after the imposition of tariffs and other trade measures. And ASEAN, however, continues to be dependable as a platform for defending open trade and economic cooperation. And on leadership in maintaining a rules-based order, for the first time, ASEAN emerged in the top position with the most confidence to uphold international law, edging ahead of the US and the EU close behind. And this is a shift in perceptions of normative leadership in the region. And it suggests that despite concerns about ASEAN's effectiveness, Southeast Asians still see ASEAN as a legitimate and trusted platform for managing regional order amidst the growing uncertainty surrounding major powers' behavior. So now I'm going to move on to another interesting section on US-China rivalry and its impact on Southeast Asia. So while this is always one of our favorite questions, so in the survey's binary choice question, a slim majority of respondents at 52% chose China over the US, reversing last year's result and also actually underscoring how finely balanced the regional sentiment remains. So support for China is stronger in 6 ASEAN member states, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Timor-Leste, Thailand, and Brunei. While US remains preferred in the Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam. However, I should warn that this should not be read as a wholesale strategic pivot to China, as you can see that the margin remains very narrow. And when asked who ASEAN would prefer as a trusted third party to hedge against the US-China rivalry, the EU, Japan, and Japan remains the top 2 choices, and that could possibly reinforces their standing as trusted and less polarizing partners in the region. As for Australia, India, UK, and South Korea, they trail some distance behind, suggesting that while Southeast Asia is open to diversification, not all middle powers are seen as equally credible strategic hedging options. Well, and this is also one of our favorite questions on the future of China relations with regional countries. So a majority of respondents at over 50% believe that their country's relations with China will improve or improve significantly over the next 3 years, suggesting a generally optimistic outlook despite ongoing tensions, and confidence is high amongst the majority of ASEAN member states. The Philippines, however, stand out as a main outlier, with a majority of respondents expecting relations to worsen, and that reflects the continued salience of tensions in the South China Sea. And of the biggest group of respondents here at 30% felt that China's interference in regional countries' domestic affairs could potentially worsen their positive impression of China, followed by China's actions in the South China Sea. However, on the other hand, 35% of respondents felt that China should resolve all territorial and maritime disputes peacefully in accordance with international law to improve relations with regional countries. And on a new question this year on China as a strategic leader of the Global South, views are, I would say, cautiously positive. At the regional level, almost 42% expressed confidence, while 29% expressed little or no confidence, and a further around 29% opt for no comment. And that could possibly suggest that they remain cautious about what this leadership might mean in practical terms for the region. And coming on to the future of US relations with regional countries, I think expectations regarding relations with the US under Trump 2.0 administration are more cautious and more uncertain. The largest group of respondents at over 37% believe relations will remain the same. and close to 33% foresee improvement, while around 30% expect the relations to worsen. And compared to a more positive perception last year, this could indicate a more guarded and wait-and-see approach towards Washington, with countries such as Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia showing higher level of concern, while Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos are more optimistic about improvement. And the top concern in the US is its use of sanctions, tariffs, and other trade measures, which is not surprising. And on what the US can do to improve relations with regional countries, the biggest group of respondents would like the country to respect international law and its institutions and not undermine the global system. And this is followed by pursuing free trade and strategic partnerships instead of punitive tariffs. And that reveals quite a bit on how our region views the US and what the US can actually do more. And is the US a reliable strategic partner? I think, well, with all that I've said earlier, there is still good news about this. Confidence in the US as a strategic partner and provider of regional security remains relatively robust, which is a good news. At the regional level, about 42.7% express confidence or strong confidence, compared to 32.3% with little or no confidence, while 25% opt for no comment. And that suggests that despite some growing economic unease, the US security role continues to be recognized and valued by a significant portion of the region. And I'm going to go on to my last slide now, which is really about the perceptions of trust and distrust rankings of major powers in the region. And on trust perceptions, Japan remains the most trusted partner in Southeast Asia at 65.6%, while many years in the running, followed by the EU at 55.9%, the US at 44%, China at 39.8%, and India at 38.4%. So Japan's continued lead, of course, reflects its reputation as a responsible stakeholder that respects and champions international law. There are many slides that I'm not going through, but you can actually refer to them to look at what exactly the region likes about that country or distrust about that country. So interestingly, although China and India remains lower in the overall ranking, their trust levels now exceed distrust, and that is for the very first time since the survey began in 2019. So this may actually suggest a gradual shift in regional perception towards a more diversified and I would say maybe multipolar strategic environment. So with that, I would like to hand the floor over to Mr. Ng once again for the second round of discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Notwithstanding Ambassador Scott's comment earlier that maybe he doesn't want to talk too much about the US-Chinese relationship for that part, I'm afraid it's not something that can be avoided. So we are coming back to this again. This second session really brings into focus this delicate strategic balancing act that is facing Southeast Asia today. The survey shows that China remains the region's most influential economic and political strategic power, while the US continues to retain considerable strategic relevance, especially in the security domain. At the same time, however, both powers, as Ambassador Scott mentioned, generate significant unease, but in different ways. What is also interesting is that beyond the two major powers, the survey shows that Japan continues to stand out as the most trusted major power, while ASEAN itself is still seen as an important stabilizing platform, especially in relation to free trade and rules-based order. So the picture that emerges is not simply one of US-Chinese competition, but of a region that's looking for balance, reassurance, and a wider set of dependable relationships. One of the clearest messages from this year's survey is that regional concern about the US has increased, and this is even before the Iran conflict. Respondents are more worried about US leadership under President Trump, particularly the use of tariffs and trade measures, and they're also more cautious in their expectations of how US relations with the region may evolve. It's not just that it's unpredictable, but even where it sort of impinges on us, it is very transactional. Therefore, while Washington remains an indispensable strategic and security actor for many Southeast Asian states, confidence in its broader leadership appears to have become more mixed and more conditional. At the same time, the region is not simply shifting entirely towards China either. even though Dr. Wang earlier was saying that, well, if ASEAN and China were to develop stronger relationship, it will become a more stabilizing factor. What the survey does show is that Southeast Asia still prefers strategic autonomy, diversified partnerships, and a stable balance among the major powers. However, the balancing space is becoming harder to sustain as rivalry deepens and as questions grow about the consistency, reliability, and intentions of external partners. Another important takeaway is that respondents are drawing a clear distinction between influence and trust. Power alone is not enough. For Southeast Asia, what matters is not just who is strongest, but also who is seen as credible, predictable, and respectful of the region. With that in mind, let me now turn to our panelists to reflect on what these findings tell us about ASEAN's relations with the major powers and about its options in a changing security and regional landscape. First, ASEAN's future, China or the United States. The survey shows a narrow reversal this year, with 52% of respondents choosing China and 48% choosing the US, if ASEAN states were forced to align with one of the two. This marks a swing back towards China after the US held a narrow lead last year and suggests that regional sentiments remains balanced and not decisively settled in either direction. Do you see this as evidence that the current US administration is inadvertently pushing Southeast Asia towards China, closer towards China, or is the margin too narrow to suggest a meaningful strategic pivot? We come back to this very important question again, which Dara also asked earlier. So Ambassador Scot and Mr. Wang, please.
Thank you. I mean, I love your survey, but I've always been skeptical of this question because in the real world, no country in Southeast Asia is going to choose, I think, to align with the US or with China. I mean, it's pretty clear that all countries want to work with the US and with China and with a lot of other countries. And I think that makes sense. It's a really smart thing. I think, though, that these numbers are useful as kind of a barometer of mood and levels of concern and levels of trust. And so we've seen them over the last several years kind of swing back and forth. Always, U.S. and China pretty close, but sometimes the U.S. is ahead. I mean, it makes it sound like it's a sporting event that one side is going to win or not, which obviously is not the case. So I think I'm actually surprised the numbers didn't swing more, given the tariffs and other things that the Trump administration did. And I think part of that, there's a couple of reasons. One is the wariness. Or I should, maybe a better way of putting it is the strong desire of Southeast Asia not to be too dependent on either of the major powers. And two is, even though I think the Trump administration's policies have generally not been warmly welcomed, particularly on the trade side in Southeast Asia, and that's I'm sure caused a negative tick up in attitudes toward the United States in some ways. The U.S. role is not just the Trump administration. I think particularly about the huge business community, which I think plays a very positive role in Southeast Asia. And the fact that although China is by far the largest trading partner, and fair enough, as an export market, the U.S. is nearly as big as China. So it's still a very important economic partner, even with the disruptions we've seen over the last year. And last but not least, to the extent that the U.S. takes actions that kind of push away or maybe discourage Southeast Asians from working with us, that the benefit of that does not necessarily accrue to China. Sure, in some cases, countries may be more willing to may want to work more with China as a result, but oftentimes they're going to work more with each other. They're going to work more with Japan, Korea, India, Australia, Europe, you name it. I mean, I think this multipolar future that Joanne mentioned and others have talked about is exactly where it goes. So it's not a zero-sum game between the U.S. and China.
Thank you. Mr. Wang?
Okay. Again, thank you for having me here. Let me also start by saying this is a very good survey. It's over the years this survey has really become one of the most closely watched snapshots of public opinion in Southeast Asia. And This year I'm seeing, and I have a privilege of getting the copy, before the media and the general public, and gave it a very good read. What I appreciate from the survey is that it reminds us Southeast Asia is not looking at the world only, or even mainly through a China or US lens. I'm also surprised that the biggest challenge identified this year is actually climate change and extreme weather at 60%, followed by economic tensions or between major powers. I think that's the message is that the concerns here are broad, are practical, are immediate. It's about livelihoods, resilience, about stability. And so, for all the geopolitical noise, Southeast Asia is still asking major powers a very basic question. Can you help make this region more stable? Or you are not trying to do that. I think about the forced choice question, which I know, it always gets a lot of attention. If ASEAN were forced to align with, either the United States or China. So, 52% would choose China this year, over 48%. I would personally be very careful with this finding. I do not think it means Southeast Asia has somehow, chosen China, quote unquote. The report itself says, the regional sentiment remains finely balanced, and I think that is exactly right. I think it also means that when the region is, pushed into some sort of uncomfortable binary, China is no longer on the losing side of that choice. Let me put it that way. I think it tells us, something more important about, the weight of economic interdependence, regional proximity, and the sense among many Southeast Asians that, however much they want to hedge, their future, is not thinkable without China. I think, at the end of the day, I think the message as reflected in the last part is, in the first part of this discussion, is that it is about strengthening ASEAN itself. And I think a confident China should be able to hear that positively. A stronger, more united, more central, more autonomous ASEAN is not bad news for China. On the contrary, if China wants a stable neighborhood, this is exactly the kind of regional order it should be very comfortable with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I move on to the next question for this part, maybe if I could just ask the online panelists whether you can keep your questions coming. There are two questions that are not yet answered. Sorry, not panelists, I mean the participants. There are two online questions that are not yet answered, but we do have half an hour for participants' questions, so keep your questions coming. If I could come to a point that I made earlier, that there's a difference between power, influence, and trust. Because actually, in terms of power and influence, sometimes it's easier to measure that, but trust is more difficult to measure. And I think a key benefit of this survey is that it does measure, it does track trust levels over time. And this year, trust in both China and India have risen slightly, with both countries' trust level narrowly exceeding distrust for the first time since the survey began in 2019. Even so, both remain below Japan and the EU in the overall trust rankings, suggesting that while perceptions may be softening, respondents are not yet fully convinced of either country's broader leadership role in the region. Does a rise in trust toward China and India signal a shift in regional preferences towards a more multipolar distribution of influence, or is it better understood as part of ASEAN's broader hedging strategy? I think this one anybody can answer, but particularly maybe Mr. Wang first, and then the rest please jump in. I think this is a important follow-up point from the discussion between Mr. Wang and Ambassador Scot earlier, because I think if I could just quickly summarize Ambassador Scot and Mr. Wang's discussion earlier, basically the two of you said that this US-Chinese choice, it's an ongoing game. It's not completed. Nobody has really won yet. But at the same time, it's also actually not just a game between these two players. There are other players involved. So that is an important point that I think flow to this question now that I'm asking. Does this rise in trust towards China and India indicate regional preference for more multipolar distribution of influence. Mr. Wang, please.
Okay, thank you. I think, yeah. I think China is not the most trusted power in the region, according to the survey. And actually, it's not just this year's survey. Japan remains first. And I think the Prime Minister of Singapore actually mentioned this fact in a Bloomberg New Economy Forum a few months ago. And to be very frank, that was not music to many Chinese mainland ears because from the Chinese mainland point of view, the Chinese mainlanders do not believe Japan is a very, well-received partner internationally. But I guess this year's report again reinforces the Singaporean Prime Minister's statement from, I think, January or from December or November. And that is, I think this is why, reports like this is also very helpful, not just for the region, but also for other countries near the region, including for the Chinese, to have a better understanding of, actually how other countries in the region saw, the United States, Japan, and other range of actors. I think I'd like to see that, the most constructive result in the whole report regarding China is actually what China can do to improve its relations with Southeast Asian countries. I'm also not very interested in, casting the result of the report to be a two-way or three-way competition between China and the United States or European Union or India. I think the Chinese takeaway hopefully could be that, at the ASEAN level, I think 35% of the respondents say, China should resolve territorial and maritime disputes peacefully in accordance with international law. And another, I think 1/4 of the respondents say China should respect the sovereignty and not constrain other countries' foreign policy choices. These are what the people in the Southeast Asia are asking for. And I think in principle, the China actually agrees with that, although, unfortunately, there is still some unresolved issue, especially with the Philippines. And but we currently have a very competent ambassador, Mr. Ng Chee Khern, in the Philippines, who was previously China's #2 in Washington, D.C. And I see he's making a lot of good moves in both standing up for China, but also, trying to push China-Filipino relations to a more constructive path. I think maybe in keeping with the traditional values of the Chinese mainland is that, trying to get some ideas of how to improve ourselves and how to show up our own understandings instead of, trashing others and saying, this is just others' fault. That would be the more useful takeaway for me, from my personal point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments from the rest of the panelists? If there isn't a comment on this, maybe if I could move on to the role of the middle powers, and in particular Japan in this case. Since Japan remains ASEAN's most preferred and trusted third-party partners in the context of the US-Chinese rivalry, with Japan at 34.2 and EU at 37.7. In terms of ASEAN's dialogue partners, Japan remains in third place in strategic relevance after China and the US, while the EU ranks fourth. So, unfortunately, although the trust level is high, the share of Japan in the region's most influential economic and strategic actor remains relatively low at below 10%, suggesting that, again, trust and preference does not automatically translate to influence. So if I could ask Dr. Kiba, how do you think middle powers like Japan can play a more strategic role in Southeast Asia? Or is it still operating in a regional order that's too much shaped by US-Chinese competition? And how Japan may grow your relative importance in the region?
Okay, so the trust to Japan has been the highest for the past years, and everybody tried to explain why, but no significant proof has been given so far. And probably one of the reasons is that Japan is less influential, but harmless. That does not harm in the region. So if I go straight to your question, so yes, the middle power like Japan and the EU can play more strategic role in Southeast Asia, which is different from the US and China. So for the economic cooperation, the middle power in the region are very important to ensure the options or the diversifying the options for the partners. As the survey mentioned the word of the third parties. Yes, we are the third parties. So the competition in economic cooperation is rather good. Particularly for the investment and the development project, the Southeast Asia has more options, including South Korea, Australia, and then the New Zealand. But what the middle power can do right now is that we have to seriously consider the resource allocation and then make the economic cooperation more effective. Okay, so we observe the downsizing the humanitarian space after the withdrawal of the USAID in the region. And so the more coordination among the middle power or the development aid providers is very necessary these days. So I think that if we can set up some mechanism to coordinate such things, then I think that the middle power can more effectively provide economic cooperation. But on security cooperation by the middle power, it's very difficult because the strategy in the region is do not force the Southeast Asian partners to take side. So the security cooperation is more difficult for us, because we can just diversify the options. We can offer better or alternative options. For example, the issue-based capacity buildings on the security governance assistance or the joint exercises to learn the international norms and standard for overseas missions, for example, the peacekeeping operations or HADR. Well, the most of the Southeast Asian countries have a richer experience in UN peacekeeping operations. So probably some other, the niche or the issue-based arena that we can work together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kiba. I think to close off this section of the seminar, if I could ask Professor Kraft for a comment on how you think ASEAN should respond to the points raised.
Hi. Yes. There are 3 points here, I think, and or maybe two. The one is, of course, the issue regarding the intensifying competition between China and the United States, and of course the corollary question about taking sides that we've been discussing, and of course the third one has to do with the issue that was pointed out by Dr. Kiba about the role played by middle powers, in particular by Japan. And I think the issue that comes out here, and again it goes back to the idea that for ASEAN, the preferences that are actually coming out of the survey is an indication of two things. Number one is the swiftly changing strategic context within which ASEAN has to actually make certain decisions, and that seems to revolve around the issue of China and the United States. As we have pointed out, I think on this particular issue, the unpredictability that we've been witnessing as far as the Trump administration's foreign policy has actually made ASEAN, or at least responses from ASEAN, seem to lean a little bit more in favor of China. In other words, the interesting point here is that it's not so much that China is winning brownie points, so to speak, and I think Mr. Wang was actually noting this, but rather it's the policies of the United States that's actually making Southeast Asian, or at least the respondents to this survey, to take a look at China as a more stable partner. So it's the uncertainty on one side, versus stability provided by China as a partner. But at the same time, and this goes back to certain points in the survey, where we see that China's attitudes and actions now in the South China Sea, still color the way that Southeast Asian countries actually see China. So there's, in other words, it's not as if we see a full realignment of things, right? And Mr. Wang actually did note this, right? And so the issues with regards to middle powers is actually a reflection on this uncertainty about, whether it's US or China. There's really discomfort with that with that binary, right? And the idea of actually seeing more and preferring more action on the part of, or at least the idea of seeing Japan as a partner, I think is important to this particular dynamic. Japan's presence in the region, mainly through its economic investments, is actually something that I think shapes the way that that this attitude towards Japan has been. It's been there for decades at this point in time, and I think that's the reason why other partners like Australia, for instance, or even India, still have some ways to go in terms of making headway as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. On the other hand, and here's a warning as far as Japan is concerned, right? Japan's advantage has always been its involvement in economic development, which is the preferred engagement within Southeast Asia, right? But the kinds of statements that we're hearing from the Japanese government at this point in time, seems to actually make or might make the Southeast Asian countries a little bit more stand back, to watch, see what further actions are going to be taken by Japan. This does not change the kinds of attitudes that you actually find towards Japan, but I think the kinds of shifting dynamics that we're seeing, makes it more important for the ASEAN countries to actually rely on themselves, right, to strengthen their relationships, and in fact provide the balance, if you will, to the kind of dynamic that's actually emerging in the region, right? If we want more stability, if we want more certainty, then I think the ASEAN countries should need to provide it for themselves, much more than actually looking at other countries, external powers, or their dialogue partners to actually provide that.
Thank you very much, Professor Kraft. I think time's up for this particular session. We can segue into the Q&A with the panelists. There is a question from Yang Xiong, which I think, if you all can see it, his question was that although this is a State of Southeast Asia survey, would it be also relevant in the future to include how dialogue partners see ASEAN in the context between ASEAN and dialogue relations? The views of Southeast Asian geopolitics need to be reviewed in balance to understand ASEAN centrality, and wondering what the panelists would see. Actually, I would ask Joanne to answer this question, because whether Joanne thinks it's worthwhile to expand the scope of this survey to include not just Southeast Asians' views, but some of the dialogue partners' views of some of the issues. It's an interesting question. And he also, I think, goes to the broader point that I think Professor Kraft in particular made, whether ASEAN centrality and whether ASEAN views is just for ASEAN alone, or whether external to ASEAN, how we should sort of look at that balance of relationships. Joanne first, and then any panelists, please.
Well, thank you, Song Yang, for that question and for always supporting, all our seminars and webinars. And that is actually a very good point, because you know that this survey actually gauges the views and perceptions of Southeast Asians towards major powers. But of course, there is also the question, and also to be fair, is equally important for us to know how dialogue partners also want to express their views on ASEAN, right? It needs to be both ways. So I've always also wanted to, this is my personal research interest, to also want to understand how dialogue partners understand the concept of ASEAN centrality and how they can do, what they can do to actually support it. But of course, that might have to be a separate study. It is very difficult to fit, that sort of findings into this particular survey. And I think we definitely within our team will think about it and find something a small version of a similar survey for dialogue partners to also express their views about ASEAN. And that's very important because most dialogue partners are doing many things. And of course, there are many categories of dialogue partnership, right? We have dialogue partnership, strategic dialogue partnership, comprehensive strategic partnership. Everybody is doing more and more to compete against each other on who is doing more within ASEAN. And we have this whole proliferation of activities. Many of them are, overlapping each other. I mean, do we actually want to continue our cooperation in this manner? So I always believe in having more coordination and having dialogue partners actually coming together to work closely with ASEAN to see who has the strength to do what, and so we will need to duplicate as well, and also to understand from them how they could support ASEAN centrality in general. So yeah, that is a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Do you have any comments on this particular question? Okay. If not, then So Young, thanks very much for your question. I think we would think seriously about it. In fact, in the past few days, as I was discussing with my researchers and fellows on issues to look at, the success of this survey is clearly important, and it's important publication because it tracks very important issues over the long term, and that's why people show some interest in it. So we want to see whether there are other topics that are of, again, sufficient evergreenness and importance that we want to track over time. Your suggestion is a very good one. If we feel that it's useful to follow up on your suggestion, we would actually actively engage you. I hope you'll be open to that. For a second question, maybe if I could ask Professor Kraft and Dr. Kiba. I've already posted it there. It comes from Indonesian Associate Research Fellow from RSIS, Gada Ramadito. You can see that question, right? Do all participants see the questions? I don't have to read it fully, right? Yeah. So the question is basically about how instead of ASEAN responding to challenges directly, whether national governments can be helped to build the capacity to address them. Actually, I think it has been done. And I'm not sure that ASEAN as an organization respond to anything in particular. It's mainly done through the national governments. But maybe if I could ask Professor Kraft and Dr. Kiba to respond to this question, please.
Yes, thank you. I think part of the and I think the issue within ASEAN and this goes back to an earlier question about what ASEAN needs to do in order to actually address questions that have to do with its ability to respond to issues around the region. And again, the key point that has to be taken into consideration is the unevenness of capabilities. And I think this was earlier mentioned in terms of technocracy, as well as technical capabilities that cuts across the region. And so yes, it it boils down to the aspirations of ASEAN that each country actually has to do what it can in order to increase its national resilience. The classic arguments that's been made in the past, but this is not something that should excuse ASEAN's inability to make decisions that strengthens its own organization, especially when it comes to issues that might actually tear itself apart. Things like Myanmar, for instance, or the issue about Thailand and Cambodia. These are internal issues that need to be resolved by ASEAN, and this goes back to the question of whether or not we need to make structural adjustments, or at least technical structural changes within ASEAN that allows it to be much more institutionalized. Remember though that there is an inherent belief in ASEAN that that ASEAN's strength has actually been made possible by the flexibility of the organization, which makes it important for some important decisions that have to be made, as far as this question of strengthening the institutions or making much more worthwhile the existing mechanisms that's the basis for how ASEAN operates now. So, thank you.
I also believe that each country should be the government of each country should be accountable to the certain issues, particularly the top concerns, including the top three challenges facing Southeast Asia, such as domestic political instability or the unemployment problems, right? Because each government has a legal bindings mechanism and also the law enforcement. But what the ASEAN should do, is more coordination, more coordination kind of roles and dialogue and the resource allocation among the member states. For example, the HADR, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, cyber security, or the cross-national or transnational issues such as the scam, which was also mentioned in the survey, the global scam or the South China Sea issues. So those are the challenges that only one country cannot tackle with. So if we talk about the capacity building or the enhancement of the capacity of each country, we have we need to take the both approach. Enhance the capability of each country, each member state, and then the assist or the cooperate with the ASEAN mechanism as a whole.
Thank you, Prof. Kraft and Dr. Kiba. I'd like to move on to two different questions. The first one is by Lai Liang Fuk, asking about online scamming, and that although the Chinese and the US have a common interest in fighting online scamming operations, since your own nationals are involved in such, or rather are victims in such scams, why is it that there's a strong reluctance to do more for this? I'm not sure whether that's even true, but I leave it to Mr. Wang and Ambassador Scot to answer this question. Whether it's true, and if it's true, why are the two countries not expending more resources to deal with this? But before you do that, there's two questions from one from Charles Brown and one from Ko Rui En, which basically asks about how ASEAN countries should approach certain geopolitical issues like the Russian attack on Ukraine, as well as the US-Israel attack on Iran, and whether ASEAN response, how should we balance between pragmatic response and principled response? I think that question Professor Kraft can answer for some of the ASEAN view, and maybe even Mr. Huang can answer for the Chinese, how the Chinese is viewing this issue in terms of a balance between pragmatic and principled approaches to dealing with it. But on the first questions first, online scamming, Ambassador Scot and Mr. Wang.
Mr. Wang,
Ambassador?
please start. No, please start.
Oh, thank you. So I think, there is no doubt that, this scamming, online scamming is a huge issue domestically in China. Let's just say the Chinese government took drastic measures, including putting restrictions on how people can, how much they can withdraw from their bank accounts, how much money they can transfer from their account to other friends, whether your smartphone, after your smartphone receives an international call, the telecom provider in China will send you a message and asking you if you have been, if you have received a fraudulent call or something. Let's just say there are, like the Chinese government spent a lot of efforts and in trying to combat this issue domestically. I'm less sure that how significant it is an issue in the United States domestically, because I think for geographic, for language, for maybe even cultural reasons, actually, I think China is, let's just say, one of the biggest centers of victims in the online scamming. And so, yes, I'm pretty sure China has huge incentives for a global cooperation on combating online scamming. But on the other hand, there is this incident where I think in October 2025, the U.S. announced it's seized 127,000 bitcoins from a Chengzhi of Prince Group in Cambodia, who has been indicted in the United States for fraud. And then the Chinese government agency accuses the United States of basically stealing those bitcoins worth over 10 billion US dollars. The Chinese believe that those money belong to the victims of the Chengzhi's scamming organization, and should be returned to its victims. But the U.S. federal authorities have somehow seized that sort of money. So that is actually because the amount is so huge. Over 10 billion US dollars. So this is something that is still unresolved at this stage. And I think even though, like, if there is a domestic demand in the United States to combat online scamming, which based on my reading is also rising in the United States, but the structural distrust of the two countries is still runs deep, and it is structural. But I guess on the bright side, actually, China and the United States have begun and have been continuing law enforcement cooperation when it comes to crack down on precursors of making chemicals for making drugs in the United States, and lately they have actually had some very good results. So I would not totally rule out the possibilities if the two sides can somehow find a solution to that particular case, as well as the need and the mechanism of working together on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. I'm not familiar with that case, so I have no comment on that. But it is a big issue in the U.S. I don't know if it's as big as it is in China. It may not be, but it's big enough to be getting attention, and certainly deserves attention. It strikes me that this is an area that has potential for cooperation between the United States and China. But like you, I agree there's a fair amount of strategic distrust that makes it hard, which is why it's a perfect opportunity for ASEAN to take the lead. Right, because most of these scam operations, at least as far as I'm aware of, are in basically mainland Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos. There are some connections to others in the region, and I'm no doubt outside the region. So it seems to me if ASEAN or an ASEAN member state were to take the lead in organizing a multilateral approach on this and inviting the China and the U.S. to join that, as well as others who are interested and involved, I would think it would make it easier for people in Washington and perhaps in Beijing to say yes than just U.S. and China together. So it seems to me an ASEAN-led approach here could be that includes outside powers could be very helpful.
Thanks. I think that's an interesting suggestion. If I could then move on to the next two questions that was asked by Charles Brown and Ko Rui-en. Prof. Kraft to start with, and then maybe Mr. Wang.
Yes.
And actually Dr. Kiba too.
Yes, thank you. The question has to do with comparing Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine with the war in Iran, and I think as far as both cases are concerned, ASEAN statements have actually ASEAN as a collective, as an organization, have actually been made, or statements have been made, calling for a desisting as far as the conflict is concerned, ceasefires and all that. And I think this is consistent with both cases. So the principled response of ASEAN has always been to be critical of the use of force, the threat to sovereignty that any conflict actually might actually lead to. But it is when you start looking at the responses of the different member states that you see a more pragmatic approach to the whole thing come in. Like, for instance, if you talk about Ukraine, you can see that in the United Nations, when there was actually a vote that was actually taken, there was quite a wide, there were differences now in the positions taken by the different Southeast Asian countries. And this depended, and of course, on relations that they actually had with Russia in particular, but with the implications of the conflict therein. Whereas if you take a look at the situation right now, similarly so, it's the pragmatic responses can be seen in terms of the differences in the positions taken by the different countries. Thailand and the Philippines, for instance, making statements that are very narrowly focused on the issue of their foreign workers that whose lives might actually be endangered by the conflict in Iran. On the other hand, you have countries like Malaysia, who's much more critical of the actions taken by the United States and Israel. So in other words, if we take a look at these particular cases, ASEAN as a collective, as an institution, as an organization, has always taken a much more principled position, as far as issues that have to do with conflicts. Now, the call is for conflicts to always end. The use of force is not the way to actually settle differences. But national interests dictate that there might actually be a difference, a more nuanced approach to how different countries might take off from that principled position, as far as applying their own national positions with regards to particular conflicts that might align more with particular interests that these countries actually have. So the consistency is that can be seen in terms of ASEAN positions, as far as conflicts are actually concerned, and the way that different countries might actually take off from that principled position, and take a much more nuanced approach, to how they might position themselves, as far as these conflicts are concerned.
I'm not sure if I can add anything more useful, but I guess it wouldn't be, in my understanding, let's draw a comparison with the European Union and its member states. For example, Spain, the member state of Spain stands out among EU member states in taking a much tougher line against the US-Israeli war on Iran. And but there are other positions for other member states of the European Union. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's not unusual, if member states have a some more nuanced position, as the professor just outlined perfectly, with ASEAN as a collective organization. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. There are three more online questions. Two of them I thought had been answered, but I'll post them up so that people can see it. One is by Xia Ming Zhen, asking about whether China can do more to gain trust. I think that is a question that Mr. Wang had already answered. But if Mr. Wang has anything more to add, Mr. Wang can do so. The other question is from Edwin Ong from Zhao Bao, who asked about this thing about the US-Chinese, the choice, and there's been several reversals in the last few years, and whether we think that this trend has finally stabilized with more choosing China in the next few years, or whether it is a matter of which superpower is making more mistakes down the road. I think this question has also been answered, but if Ambassador Scot or Mr. Wang wants to add any more, please do so. But before those two questions, which I thought had been answered, where you can add more comments, let me come to this question that Indonesian local government officer in East Java asked, which basically has to do with the balance between bottom-up initiatives that's more localized and whether the national government is structured to amplify that and help the local governments, or whether sometimes it overrides the localized issues to the detriment of localized issues because of national imperatives. I think that comment, if I could ask Prof. Kraft to sort of look at the question and try to internalize and answer the question, well, Ambassador Scot and Mr. Wang think of whether they want to answer those two other questions, which I think had been actually answered. Prof. Kraft?
Thank you. It's an important question, precisely because to a certain extent, local government concerns might actually be ignored, or might actually be not seen as being a priority by national governments, simply because national governments are, of course, operating at a different level. And so when I think the interesting thing is that within ASEAN, when ASEAN principles, agreements are actually entered into, and negotiated, more often than not, the negotiation takes place between national governments, and so therefore it's national interests that are actually taken into consideration. The issue, however, is to what extent there is a trickling down, if you will, of both the policies as well as the resources that are needed in order to be able to pursue these kinds of issues at the local level. The other thing that has to be taken into consideration is whether local governments actually have the technical wherewithal to be able to take into consideration those issues. So when you talk about things like, for instance, scams, as an example, since that was actually raised earlier on, more often than not, the approach taken, the kinds of policies that are actually undertaken, is something that's actually applied at the national level. The unfortunate thing is most victims, of course, are at the local level. So the question that has to be taken into consideration here is whether local governments have the capability to deal with the kinds of issues that are actually being discussed at the national level. But having said that, clearly for most of the ASEAN countries, the effectiveness of the kinds of policies that are actually undertaken, see their most effective implementation with regards to, of course, how local government units are benefited by the kinds of agreements that are actually undertaken by national governments in their engagements with the with regional partners, right? So it's this need to address the implementation of regionally agreed upon agreements by the national governments as to how they're going to be implemented and seen to be implemented within with the help of course local government units. And so local governments need to actually be upgraded as far as their capabilities are concerned in order to be able to address the kinds of issues that I think are agreed upon at the national level.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's almost ending. We are reaching 11 o'clock. Ambassador Scot and Mr. Wang, do you have anything more to add? Otherwise, I thought the questions actually had been answered.
I don't have anything to add to what we said earlier.
Mr. Wang?
Yeah, I just want to comment very briefly on the question from a professor at Xiamen University. I think the question actually reflects like the genuine sometimes confusion in the Chinese mainland when quite some people when they read reports like this, like a lot of people are genuinely confused that how could China be compared with the United States when it comes to violations of international norms? They are throwing bombs on foreign nations, and what did we do? I think seriously that's the Chinese domestic genuine, sincere feeling, because for all sorts of reasons, and I guess there is a big gap there, and it will be some serious effort will have to be made for to actually improve the dynamics, the relationships, the Chinese understanding of how Southeast Asia actually sees China, especially when it comes to the conduct involving South China Sea. And I think this report is actually part of the very necessary efforts in making that clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our panelists for your thoughtful and insightful reflections. If I could ask all the participants to join me in thanking them for helping us unpack the survey findings and their wider implications for Southeast Asia. I think we have had a very wide-ranging, insightful discussions. Thank you very much. I'll hand the floor back over to our MC now.
Thank you, Mr. Ng, Ms. Lin, and our esteemed panelists, Ambassador Scot Marciel, Dr. Saya Kiba, Dr. Wang Huiyao, Mr. Wang Zichen, and Professor Herman Kraft for your valuable insights in helping us understand what the survey results say about Southeast Asia's outlook on regional and international developments. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the program for the e-launch and discussion of the State of Southeast Asia 2026 Survey Report. The digital copy of the survey is available for download on the ISEAS Yusof Ishak's website, or it can be accessed by scanning the QR code on the screen. The link is also available on the webinar chat. Thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead.